After Rita, Jonathan, and Mrs. Plummer realized that the police officer was one of those killers, they locked all the doors. "We've got to call the police," Jonathan said fearfully. Mrs. Plummer said, "No, they're no longer reliable. First, we need to get somewhere safe." Rita said with fear, "But where should we go?" Mrs. Plummer said, My private detective told me to come to Knife Forest. Do you have a car?" Jonathan answered, "Yes, but we're running out of gas." Mrs. Plummer replied, "It's not that far, but for now, we should wait for an opportunity to escape." An hour later, when the police officer was a bit away, they quickly got into the car and drove towards Knife Forest. Rita, who was scared, asked, "Mrs. Plummer, why are we going to your private detective?" Mrs. Plummer answered angrily, "I don't know, you silly girl. You've got a better idea?" Rita remained silent. Suddenly, Jonathan screamed in panic, "Look! He's following us!" When Rita and Mrs. Plummer looked back, they saw the police officer chasing them. Go faster, please," said Mrs. Plummer, who was terrified. As Jonathan sped up, the police officer sped up as well. When they reached Half Moon Lake, Rita asked, "How much gas is left?" Jonathan said sadly, Shit, we're almost out of it." Mrs. Plummer said, "You don't have to be worried. In a few minutes, we will reach a restaurant on the way. We're safe there." And at that moment, Rita received a message. While looking at her phone, she said, "Mom sent a message. I think she drew the face." Jonathan said, "I bet that guy looks like this goddamn cop." Mrs. Plummer asked, "What are you guys talking about?" Jonathan answered, "Our mother has seen the face of our father's boss. She was supposed to draw the face and send it to us." Rita said, God damn it, the signal is weak here." They saw Mrs. Stasher's restaurant in the distance. Mrs. Plummer said, "Stop at the restaurant, lock the doors, and no one gets out." The police officer was hooking behind them, and that made them all stressed out. Finally, they reached the restaurant and parked behind a red car. The police officer also stopped a little away from them. Jonathan said, "What should we do now?" The police officer got out and pointed his gun at them. At that moment, Mrs. Plummer took out a whistle and blew it 3 times. Rita, who still had her cell phone in her hand, said, "Finally! I've got Mom's message!" The police officer came to their car and shouted, "Get out of the car and put your hands on it! Don't make me shoot you!" Rita said to Jonathan with a trembling voice while she was staring at the drawing that her mom sent. Jonathan, did Mom say anything about whether that person was a man or a woman?" Jonathan said, "No. Why? What's wrong?" Rita could no longer move. Jonathan grabbed the phone and looked at their mother's drawing. It was Mrs. Plummer's face. At that moment, someone hit the police officer from behind, and he fainted. Rita and Jonathan were shocked, and there was a deadly silence in the car. But then, Mrs. Plummer said, with a devil's smile on her face, You're safe now, my darlings. No one can hurt you anymore.